My name is Emily McLean. I'm going to be the moderator for today's session. We have a mix of live and pre-recorded rounds today. After each presentation, there will be a short Q&A session. And if we have time at the end, I'll take more questions. Feel free to type your comments in the chat box and we'll get to them if time allows. A recording of this presentation will be available 30 days after the summit ends. You'll receive an email in a few days that will explain how to access that recording. It is now my pleasure to introduce our panelists for today. For our first presentation, it will be co-hosted by Andrew Harrington and Leo Landis, both who work at the State Historical Museum of Iowa. Andrew is an exhibits manager at the State Historical Museum of Iowa, and he enjoys collaborating with many of his colleagues and brings incredible stories to Iowa audiences. Andrew earned his BA in anthropology from the University of Iowa and his MA in museum studies from George Washington University. His background includes archaeological field and lab work with the Iowa Office of the State Archaeologist. Leo Landis is a museum curator for the State Historical Museum of Iowa. He's also worked at the Salisbury House in Des Moines, and he also had previous positions at Living History Farms in Urbandale, Connor Prairie and Fishers, and he was a curator for 8 years at the Henry Ford Museum in Greenfield Village in Dearborn, Michigan. He received his Bachelor's of Science in History from Iowa State University and his Master's of Arts in Historical Administration from Eastern Illinois University in Charleston. Our second presenter is Lisa Kent. She has a wonderful presentation on grant writing today, and she's been a grant writer for nearly 20 years. The last 8 working as a development coordinator and grant writer for the State Historical Society of Iowa. She earned her Bachelor of Science in Journalism from the University of Iowa and her Doctor of Veterinary Medicine from Iowa State University. Our last presentation will be shared by Travis and Wally. Travis, I'm so sorry, I might mess up your last name. I apologize. Travis Schoenbein. He's an assistant planner in the City of Dubuque's Planning Service Department, where he's worked for 3 years. He has extensive experience preparing Section 106 historic preservation reviews of city housing projects using federal funds for review by the State Historic Preservation Office. He has also worked on implementation of Dubuque's comprehensive plan, updates of Dubuque County's Community Health Needs Assessment and Health Improvement Plan. Wally Wernemont has served as a planner with the City of Dubuque since 2001. He has served as a staff person for the Dubuque Historic Preservation Commission and manages the federally mandated Section 106 reviews. He was instrumental in the creation of a unified development code and the updating of the Historic Preservation Ordinance. He had the honor to represent the United States as a part of APEKSI ICMA Professional Fellows Exchange Program, where he visited and presented to the Indonesian federal government. I hope you all join me in giving a virtual round of applause to all of our amazing panelists today. First up will be Andrew and Leo, and I will let them take the field.
Thank you, Emily. Hopefully everyone can hear me and see our slides here. Yeah, thank you everyone for joining. This is going to be obviously a pretty quick overview on developing exhibits and hopefully give you some good ideas on moving forward with developing your own exhibit projects. So we're going to cover briefly how to get started with your project, organizing your content, selecting artifacts and images, label writing, design and layout, and then, as Emily said, we'll have a few minutes at the end for questions. So an exhibit, as I'm sure many of you know, is a creative and visual way to interpret a topic for an audience. It's a great way to introduce a topic, encourage people to discover something new, and hopefully after they've looked at your exhibit and left your building, it'll inspire them to seek out information on their own. Something to caution that an exhibit is not is a book on the wall or an exhaustive overview of a topic. There's never enough room, and audience attention spans just aren't long enough. At the State Historical Museum of Iowa, we have a variety of exhibits on display, from fairly simple to more complex, from anywhere from 300 square feet to about 10,000 square feet. We also have a traveling mobile museum that we take throughout the state. For this session, though, we're going to focus on a recent 900 square foot exhibit that we developed called Iowa and the Great War. The first step in your process is bringing focus to your exhibit. What is that key thing you want your audience to take away? You could also call this your thesis statement, or in museums, it's often referred to as the big idea. Beverly Sorrell, in her seminal book on exhibit label writing, offers this explanation. The big idea provides an unambiguous focus for the exhibit team throughout the exhibit development process by clearly stating in one sentence the scope and purpose of an exhibition. So this is really important because there are always great ideas, but you have to have a clear focus. If all elements of the exhibit don't support that big idea, then that could be a sign that you're trying to do too much, or you're just not focused enough. And if visitors can't easily grasp what you're trying to do fairly quickly on, they could lose interest and walk away. So in Iowa and the Great War, when you, this exhibit unfortunately is no longer on display, but when it was, when you would enter the exhibit on the right, you would see our large mural graphic, our introductory text, and after reading that, the visitor should come away with what our big idea is, which for this would be when Iowa joined the nation. When Iowa and the nation joined World War I on April 6, 1917, they marched into an era of tremendous change that would have lasting implications for Iowa and the United States. So that was our overall focus, and all of our elements really supported that. And this is that main wall that you would see when entering the exhibit, and with our introductory text here on the left. So a word on exhibit teams. You know, obviously this is going to really depend on the size of your organization and the size of your staff and the complexity of the exhibit that you're trying to tackle. For us, just an example, we include our exhibits manager, myself, our curator, Leo, our collections registrar, our collections coordinator, an educator, a designer, both a graphic designer and someone to design the physical layout, and any outside experts that might be needed, whether that's an advisory committee, a videographer, et cetera. For smaller organizations, and even if we're doing a smaller exhibit ourselves in-house, this team could be obviously much smaller. And sometimes we will wear more than one hat here. If you're a rather small organization, you may be doing all of these things yourself, which is fine. It's just going to depend on the size of your organization and really what you're trying to do. And now I'm going to turn it over to Leo, and he'll talk about organizing content. Hold on, let me get this stopped here.
So with our idea of doing exhibits, Andrew laid out the overall framework with the big idea, and that really is the central theme. I think both of us can't say too much. Beverly Sorrell's book is just really a great guideline. And so around that big idea, we'll create an outline that usually has 3 sub-themes at no more than 5. If you're trying to bring in more than 5 in an exhibit that's around 900 to 5,000 square feet, you may be trying to do too much. And so those themes can be, in this case, we looked at Iowa at the beginning of the war in the military service. We looked at Iowa on the home front, and then after the war. So those were the three areas that we illustrated within the Iowa and the Great War exhibit. Also, as you're working on that outline, it's important to be mindful of diversity concerning geography and people. Since we're the state museum, people expect to see their stories represented, and it's all our history here. So we are very mindful of including a broad perspective. I think if you want to ask me what we left out, I'd be glad to answer that. I don't want to get into it now, but we really do try to be mindful also of geographic diversity. Sometimes folks in Western Iowa or in Northeast Iowa or Southeast Iowa feel like we only talk about Des Moines. So we really consciously select objects and illustrate stories that come from across the state. We're mindful of that. And when you're selecting, let me go back to that slide. I'll just talk about it really quick, the one right before. Sorry, jumping you back and forth. In our intro case, we made sure to have a uniform from a nurse. So that's in the back left that you see on that slide in the foreground. And she was from Des Moines. Her name was Ruth Piquel. In the foreground on the left is an Army uniform from a man from Story County, Iowa, so north central, just north of Des Moines. Then in the middle center is an airman's uniform from a man from Des Moines. In the back was a naval uniform from a man who was serving at Great Lakes Naval Station. He died of influenza, and he was from Sigourney, so Keokuk, kind of southeast Iowa. In the back left, or back right, excuse me, is a Marine uniform. And that was one story. We were still working on some of the research, and we haven't pinned down that soldier. That's part of the history of our collection, is sometimes just like everyone else, we don't always have the best details on some things that came in 50 to 100 years, or close to 100 years ago. Then on the foreground on the right is the uniform from Edward Fleur, who Fleur Drive here in Des Moines is named. And that was a recent acquisition. And working with Andrew, we were able to work that into our display. And that photograph of him that's in the foreground on the right is the photo that was hanging on the wall in his family home. And the family also donated some glass plate negatives showing that photo on the wall when his body was brought back from France in 1921, and they had a funeral service. So having those images in the collection are incredibly useful too. When it comes to selecting artifacts, we use those same ideas where we look at diversity from across the state, really compelling stories. And so in this case, you do see another uniform on the far right. In the center is a uniform for an airman from Colfax, Iowa, James Norman Hall, who became an author after the war, and he served in the Lafayette Escadrille. That's a book he wrote in the foreground. And there's also radio talking about changes in technology, a World War I Army era radio. And then on the far right is a tunic that belonged to James Morris, James B. Morris, who was an African-American officer, one of the men trained at Fort Des Moines. And that's the image on the artifact layer, on the label there on the left side, upper left, that's talking about Fort Des Moines and Camp Dodge as the training sites. So we have those artifacts and then some representative artifacts. So I talked about associated artifacts, James Norman Hall and our James Morris. Those are artifacts associated with important stories connected to Iowans. That's what associative artifacts mean. Representative artifacts are those things on the foreground and the right, things like a canteen, a gas mask, the canteen cover, and there's a little sewing kit on the far right that was a World War I sewing kit. The same with the radio, that's an representative artifact. The James Norman Hall and the James B. Morris uniforms also serve the role of representing air service during the war in the case of Hall, or in the case of Morris, the service of African-American men. So they also represent larger stories connected to the themes that we were illustrating in that military service section. And then aesthetic artifacts Those are artifacts that are visually interesting. I would argue that that radio, the problem with the slide that you're seeing is the channel that connects the two pieces of plexiglass for that case kind of break up the radio, but it's a nice kind of brass, wood, and black flat artifact. So it has some visual intricacy to it. That's what I mean by aesthetic. And same with the book cover. You've got a nice biplane there. So visually interesting. And that's what those images also do for you. So whether it be the Victory, Liberty, Loan poster that's inset on that new kind of war label on the right side, or the background image of soldiers at Camp Dodge that was an Iowa unit, or the image of those are the captains who were being commissioned out of Fort Des Moines, the African-American men from all over the United States who were training at at Fort Des Moines. So having images is important too. And here's an example of one of our aftermath cases. And again, you've got a large background image there of the state capitol when the 168th Infantry had a returning home event in May of 1919. But we also then in this case talked about how suffrage was supported by women serving in various aspects of the war. Also, we have some medals there in the foreground. One is from a man named Eldon Friel, who was from Clark County, so south central Iowa. And then his brother Galen died of influenza at Iowa State. That's his memorial certificate there. So again, that's kind of a representative artifact, but it represents the stories. Both those represent the stories. And the center medal on that panel next to or in the center that has the three medals, that's James B. Morris's Victory Medal, Service Medal in the center of the rainbow ribbon that you see there. So again, bringing in those stories as representative and associative artifacts. And then on the right are some very representative, but again, aesthetically interesting. The Women's Suffrage Amendment poster has the yellow pennant that shows the color being used for women's suffrage was yellow and black typically, and then also some other suffrage materials. So some aesthetically interesting artifacts again. Then the types of labels that we'll use, and again, Andrew talked about that primary label, the main big idea label as you came in, but you'll have primary labels, secondary labels, and ID labels. And we use guidelines, as we said, in exhibit labels. It's about more than just exhibit labels, truly, by Beverly Sorrell. And Andrew has a nice slide of some resources at the end, and the program, of course, is recorded. The real main ideas are be concise. We'll limit our word length to about 100 words. Sorrell says 25 to 75. We try to shoot for around 90 as the longest. We'll let it go up to 100 at times. If we go over 110, we'll usually say that's got too much in it, and we'll break that into chunks. Use a writing style that applies to everyone. And as we all know, there's always too much information to try to share, especially visually. And so one of the techniques we've used is using slideshows to share some of those images. And then as we talk about the types of labels, you'll see the primary label for the Iowans at Home case. That's the supporting the war panel there. Then on the right side of the screen is a secondary label, smaller type, and Andrew will get into this. And you see that's one where we broke up the paragraph or broke up the content into two paragraphs. People will read more if it's broken up like that. And then you've got ID labels. So typically on ID labels, what we really like to do is connect 2 or 3 artifacts to an idea or a theme if we can, and then have those on one labels. That keeps us from cluttering up our exhibit too. So the artifacts labels are those small ones next to the objects. One is a roster of people who were helping the Red Cross in Shelby County, Iowa, so Western Iowa. And the other artifact on the right is actually with the 2 pieces of paper next to each other. That's the proclamation that banned all foreign languages. It often gets called the Babel Proclamation. That was used it was usually called the English they called it the English only proclamation. Sometimes it's been called Babel proclamation, but that wasn't really a term used in the period. So that's Governor Harding's English only proclamation from our state archives collection. On label basics, just to illustrate some of the points that Beverly Sorrell talks about, more visitors read shorter labels. And so, as we said, long labels, try to keep your paragraphs into 75 words to 100 words, break them apart if possible. And when I talked about conversational or easy to read language, don't try to tell everything you can, and keep it in a label or a writing format that really is easy for anybody to translate in their own mind, so that you aren't using big words. Nice, concise sentences free of adverbs and adjectives will help keep your word count down too, and make it a little easier for people to translate any unfamiliar vocabulary. Then having objects next to the elements that they relate to seems obvious, but sometimes it's one of those things that you forget about. And so make sure that what you're talking about relates to nearby objects or materials that you have photographs in the display. And then labels that contain concrete, visually referenced information make people want to read. So if you want people to read your labels, try to put an image on that label until you get down to that artifact level label, and then it's okay to leave an image out. People are going to generally make that association. Then labels with images and words working together are meaningful and memorable to more visitors than all text labels. So those two things relating to each other. Then some of the deadly sins that Beverly Sorrell talks about: labels that are not related to a big idea, that ramble without focus or objectives. And again, don't try to tell people everything, and be concise. When I go through a second time, and I'll have 2 to 3 people read my label content. Besides, Andrew will read it, and we'll have a copy editor look at it. So don't bring an ego into your label writing. Have a good proofreader look at them. And then labels that have too much emphasis on instruction rather than offering provocation. And that was what Andrew was talking about. Our exhibits are meant to inspire people. Sometimes people are concerned about saying, well, you're not educating people. You're going to educate them regardless. Really, a great exhibit is going to inspire people to say, I want to know more about that story. That's the purpose of museum exhibits and interpretation, is to inspire people. Labels that don't address a visitor's prior knowledge, interests, and or misconceptions. That's one of Freeman Tilden's principles of interpretation as well, is to start with what a visitor knows, put it within their frame of reference, hopefully for a large audience, and then go from that point. Again, if there's no design, and Andrew will talk about this in a minute, that's important. Labels written with a vocabulary that is out of reach for a majority of visitors. So you don't have to prove how smart you are, you prove how well you can inspire people. Labels that are too long and wordy, labels that ask questions that are not the visitor's questions, labels for interactives that do not have instructions or interpretations located in an integrated logical way, labels that do not begin with concrete visual references, and labels that are hard to read because of poor typography. And again, Andrew will talk about that. Just as I wrap up, I want to comment too, one of the things that we do as part of our process, Andrew referenced the advisory committees. We don't always have an advisory committee, but if there's a topic I know that group might have a point of view on, or that I may not be the best authority, I'll reach out to that group. So often if we're writing about the Meskwaki experience in Iowa, to make sure that I'm not mischaracterizing anything from their perspective, I will send that content to either Jonathan Buffalo or Mary Youngbear at the settlement and say, hey, can you give this a look and make sure I'm capturing the story correctly? And they've always been helpful and responsive on that. We've also done some other outreach to other groups, but that's one that we're certainly conscious of. And so as you look at your storytelling, don't worry about always being the authority, and reach out to people that may be able to assist you in developing your content. And so with that, I am going to stop my sharing and turn it back to Andrew.
Okay, thank you, Leo. Hopefully everyone can see and hear me now. Yeah, just to touch more on label design here. Here you can see our primary, secondary, and ID labels side by side. So you can really see both the size difference and the design differences there. You could also separate things by color, be creative with it. But for us, each major section of this exhibit has a primary label. So if someone's in a hurry, if they read nothing else, hopefully they will at least read that primary label and get the general understanding of what's going on. And for those who want to dive deeper, that other content is there. Real quickly, you can see here some of the do's and don'ts of label typography. Really designing for readability is the main thing. You don't necessarily want to use a fancy font that might be hard to read, something like cursive, which especially younger audiences may not be able to read. And keep that simple, but also, like Leo said, use images and photos to help tell that story without always having to rely on words. For Iowa and the Great War, we actually worked with a local graphics company to produce the labels and the mural graphics that we have. But if we're doing something in-house, a smaller display, I'll mount our labels onto something like foam core board or matte board. It gives us the label something rigid to be on, and then you can either prop that up or put it on the wall. I think it makes it look nicer. It's something that's easy to do yourself with a little bit of practice. And these are some of the tools that you might use for that. Again, as Leo said, sometimes we'll do some slideshows with some additional content that we can't physically fit into the exhibit. So this is a great method for photographs and images. So we had a running slideshow that would loop on a monitor in the gallery that would include additional photos of Iowans who served in the war. As far as the physical layout and design, I always like to do a scale mock-up of the exhibit space and the cases in something like Adobe Illustrator. There's also a free equivalent program out there called Inkscape. You could also do this on graph paper. It doesn't really matter, just as long as you have something to scale and that you can lay out the space either on paper or on your screen before you ever get to the point of actually installing. So you know that everything will fit beforehand. So for this particular exhibit, it was most important to have these elevation drawings of the exhibit cases. So this is a view of one of our 25-foot exhibit cases. We had 3 of these in this particular exhibit. So this shows our home front section. And what I did, I had the design for all the labels, and I could put those in on the computer. I used Illustrator for this. I could put those in. All of the things that you see in black are artifacts from our collection, the approximate sizes, and then the white boxes are some platforms that we had that we were reusing from a previous exhibit. And so I laid this all out, and I knew that everything could fit and that it looked nice. It wasn't overly cluttered, but there wasn't a lot of empty space either. So this was tremendously helpful. And then here you can see the mock-up on top with the final version on the bottom. As far as displaying artifacts, for us, one of the major things is obviously doing it in as safe a way as possible. So there are a variety of ways that you can do this. We have some painted plywood or MDF boxes that we have built that we can use as platforms to raise things up. I like to provide some variety in how things are displayed so it doesn't become monotonous. Using things like archival mounting corners. for documents. There are also loads of acrylic book stands and artifact stands and mounts that you can purchase online. So there are a lot of ways to go with that. For this exhibit, we also created a traveling component called the World War I Honor Roll. And this has been really nice. It doesn't include any artifacts with it. And it's essentially a fabric over a metal framework. And it packs up small. We can put it into a minivan, and we travel this. We've been traveling this throughout the state. So this is another great way to get your content out there in a reasonably affordable way, and it can fit in a variety of places. We've been to a lot of public libraries, smaller museums, and this is just a really nice, flexible way to get information out there. And I wanted to end this talk on an important and timely topic of DEAI, which stands for Diversity, Equity, Accessibility, and Inclusion. At the State Historical Museum, we strive to ensure that Iowans see themselves in the exhibits and programs we produce, and that we're telling Iowa history from a variety of viewpoints. So this can be either geographic, ethnic, and cultural, or socioeconomic diversity. It could also be physical. It includes physical accessibility. I included on here an image of the Smithsonian's guidelines for accessible exhibit design. This is available online as a PDF download. We would encourage you to explore these ideas and how you can incorporate them into your exhibit projects. There's a lot of information out there, from the American Alliance of Museums to other organizations. So please take a look at that. And again, here are some of the resources that we mentioned, and this will be available as this is recorded and available in the future. So I'll stop there, and we can take any questions.
Well, I see the first question is, what do we include in the content on artifact labels? And I will look at, in the narrative that you see, and that's usually under 50 words, talking about what those things are. And then we do essentially ID information on that. ID information, it's usually what it is and where it is from, possibly. So if it was used in Lyon County or Van Buren County or Lee County or Fremont or Allamakee, what county it was from generally. And that's what we do on photographic IDs as well. And then the date, if we know that, either a year, if in the narrative, we'll sometimes put specific dates. So in the narrative of that label, put content about what it is, but then identify what it is in a bulleted list. So that's how we do our artifact IDs, but great question.
And I can hit a couple of these here, and I know we're running out of time, and we can maybe, if there's time at the very end, we can circle back around. But as far as where we get some of the display items we showed, there is a company called Art Display Essentials, and that's included on that resources list. I think it's artdisplay.com. There's also places like Gaylord Archival and University Products. And then I'll jump to the end. There's a question about the fonts used for label text. We typically keep it to a sans serif font. Anything from as simple as Arial to Open Sans. Something similar to that. It's good for legibility, and it's just easy to read. So we keep it fairly simple a lot of the time.
All right.
I'll quickly just answer the last question, because I think I've got one minute. Paula Moore asked about other themes. In Iowa History 101, we used themes of Iowans at home, work, and play. In writing through history, we used the big idea of Iowans and recreational bicycling. So we talked about the start of bicycling in Iowa, a little bit on gender and bicycling, and then RAGBRAI's history from beginning to 2013.
Awesome. And then are you both available for contact or for help across the state?
Yep, absolutely.
Yes,
Always.
big yes.
Yep.
Awesome. Well, thank you both for your contribution and your wonderful presentation today.